Last story I have is from a chef named Eric Huang. And last week he came out with a piece called The Curse of the Man in the Arena, Part 1.
Uh-oh.
And so he kind of goes into this idea of why aren't chefs critics of restaurants? And then he kind of like supplements that by saying, why don't critics need to have any sort of like, he calls it kind of like relevant expertise in working in restaurants to basically provide these make or break pieces of content for some of these businesses that like he has run in his career. And so the reason that I have kind of been put on to Eric's content is because he has been one of these kind of like outspoken people of Michelin. And I think he is just one of those people. I have never chatted with Eric. And so again, like this is not me throwing shade, but it is kind of like his pieces of content made me start to think about this concept of the meta of Michelin, because he very much so, in the way that I'm perceiving how he's reacting to Michelin's behavior as of late, it seems to me like he's the type of person who is like, I miss when the meta was like this, or I think the meta has changed and I'm upset about it. So he puts out this piece, and I'll read a couple of lines from it, because I think, one, if you are somebody who is like particularly, it's like a harsh open wound, you just got a really bad negative review from somebody, or you're potentially thinking about making content of your own as a chef, I think this can be a really like cool nudge in the right direction, because I think those of us who have worked in restaurants, especially for long periods of time in different types of establishments, we can sometimes feel like a level of imposter syndrome. And he does, kind of like touch on some of those points here. And so again, Curse of the Man in the Arena, he says, to be clear, he says, why are most of the people in the profession of reviewing food not chefs? And would the space of food writing improve if there were more chefs in it? Later, he says, I asked the question because reviewing restaurants requires no relevant experience or technical expertise, and yet food critics are the kingmakers of our industry. True, most artistic media is judged subjectively by someone in the gallery as opposed to someone in the arena, end quote. And so he kind of goes on to talk about why this is important, why he has been frustrated on it in the past, and he breaks it down into 4 kind of like sections of the main piece on his Substack, where he says, covering legacy print media, content creators, the democracy of aggregated reviews, and the oligarchical society of restaurant guides. So he kind of breaks it down. It's pretty well written. Like, it was kind of a fun read for me to kind of like go through it, because one, he has such a wealth of restaurant experience, and that he has also done like a lot of this writing stuff. And so I think he has like credentials on both ends of it. There was one line that kind of ties into the death of the show dish piece that I just wanted to read to you, and you can kind of let me know your thoughts here. He says, the disadvantage that concerns me the most, however, is the susceptibility to gimmicks and illusions. This is content creators and potentially new quote unquote food critics in the industry. He says, quote, it makes me think of The Dark Knight Rises. As Bane is giving Batman a generational ass whooping, Batman throws out his bitch-made smoke bombs to try and distract his opponent long enough for a sneak attack. Bane taunts him for the cheap trick. Theatricality and deception, powerful agents to the uninitiated, but we are initiated, aren't we, Bruce? End quote. And I'll just say a little bit more here. He says, seasoned chefs are initiated. We are well-versed in the various genjutsu that chefs use to deceive you. We are more impressed by something that is impossibly simple rather than something that is unnecessarily complex. And delivering on impossibly simple is far more difficult. He says, I appreciate that you've sent your most attractive sommelier to tell me the story about how the chef is serving you kabocha squash because he grew up with his grandmother's pumpkin patch. He's serving it this evening with a smoked pork jus and freshly shaved katsuobushi in her honor. The som carves it in front of you, and for a moment you can picture the young boy at his grandmother's side as wisps of steam dance away from the lidded mauviel. But the fantasy is dispelled when I remember I also had a Baldor rep call me this morning to peddle late-season squash, end quote. And so all of that, like, very kind of tongue-in-cheek language you'll find throughout the entire piece. I do think that it is like, he does talk about some things that I would say that I personally disagree with. He particularly calls out Pete Wells in saying, like, Pete Wells have never worked brunch in his life, therefore he can't be a food critic or food writer. And I think you look at some of the people who have been incredibly, like, well versed in both critiquing food, being a guest, ordering well, being a good judge of taste on the guest side. Some chefs make really horrible guests, so to speak, because they either exclusively want to ball out because it is like their one night off, or again, like, they don't have a well-developed enough kind of like sense of eating out to actually be able to talk about food. I talked about this in content for a reason. But then I think you see the success of people like Anthony Bourdain structuring his career in this way, doing the industry experience first and then going into writing. And I don't disagree that like there could be a benefit to actually seeing a little bit of behind the scenes action here. The thing that kind of like, and Ray, you can correct me if this is a poor football analogy here, but it is kind of like saying that you can't coach football without having played football yourself, at least at a reasonably high level. And I don't think that's true. Like you see so many examples of coaches who are really, really good coaches, and they don't have like an NFL star-studded, you know what I mean? Like resume that they can tell, but they're really, really good coaches. And I think the same kind of applies to food critics. You don't have to have been a, chef de partie at a restaurant to write about food. And so it's an interesting piece. We're going to link it in the show notes if you want to kind of go into that next. That's the last story I had, Ray. Do you have any thoughts on it?
Just say this. I work in food development, and it's always like, you want to make stuff that you think customers will like, but you also have to come from the lens of what would a customer want. And if, like, when you go to a restaurant or a food critic reviews a restaurant, they're reviewing it from the lens of a customer going there, not having that background, right? And so I would push back that, like, that's the whole point of a food critic is we might get it, but if the customer doesn't get it, then like they're not going to enjoy it. So I see both sides of it. On the other side, like you would hope a food critic is well versed in some aspect of food. Maybe they're not a restaurant worker, but at least they know the basics of dining out. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and I think this goes back to our initial conversation, our second conversation over the the dining culture in 2025. It's like people I just maybe it's a response to the TikTokers that can just like review food from their cars and like they're a salient voice to a restaurant or this and that. And like I love some of those and I hate some of those, but it's just like the world's changing and the world's evolving and it's just so crazy to think where dining's going to be with reviewing and is Michelin held up higher or was it Keith Lee or whoever held up higher? Because for most like younger people, he's held in higher regard than the Michelin. So it's like, where do we go from here? So
I'll share two last anecdotes, which I think are just funny to hear about because you'll hear this on one hand saying, "Oh my goodness, we would benefit so much as an industry if chefs were the critics and we were kind of like for chefs by chefs, this type of thing." But then you'll sometimes see people who get upset at chefs going into content creation or going into highlighting restaurants because they'll say like, "Oh, well, you weren't good enough to open a restaurant of your own, and now you're just kind of like making content here." And I am also been on the receiving end of like people singing praises for the fact that my going out to eat videos include some nuance that they wouldn't have picked up as a consumer because it's like I have worked in these environments and I know why some of these things are either impressive genuinely or this is just like smoke and mirrors and this is not something to be excited about. And so so that I think is just an interesting side effect of the way that people kind of perceive these things. And then the other one is how many times have you seen chefs going out to eat at restaurants of their homies? And so it's almost like the critic is valuable because they are this like bastion of no relationship, if that makes sense. Like they are untethered and have the ability to be as subjectively objective as you can be in an industry where how much does it taint your experience if you go to a restaurant and you have a really bad meal and you're a chef food writer and it's your, close coworker who's running that restaurant that you guys used to work at 11 Madison Park back in the day.
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden you're going to come out and bash them or you're not going to create a piece of content because you're upset about this meal. It's like, oh man, like now that's all screwed up. You know what I mean? I've dealt with this too, right? Like you go to an experience and it's not up to snuff and it's like, how do you navigate that? How do you know what to say? Because I do think that if we were to say like, okay, magic wand, all critics who have not worked in restaurants get pushed off the board and we replace all of them with chefs as the writers now, it would just become like a boys club. And, like women would be in there too. But I think you kind of get what I'm saying, where it's like you would just basically hype up your homies. You would just like pedestalize your friends. And then it's or you would just go after your enemies, people who like wronged you in the past. You as a chef who is so well versed in the ability to talk about food, you just totally like tear places down. I just think it's an interesting read. Again, I think that like Eric uses a lot of these writings to like air some of his other grievances, which I think is like a really cool way to process it because from an entertainment perspective, I get to read it. And so just we'll link it in the show notes. If you want to read it, please do. Ray and I are going to be back next week with probably another duo episode because I think that, again, with taking a little bit of time away, it's crazy that we can take like a week off and there's just so many stories to cover. But, awesome for us because we just get to continue to jam on these stories. If you want to make sure that you're supporting the show and making sure that other people who probably think similarly to you, want to be educated, want to be kind of like up to date on what's happening in the industry, share this episode